right? Literally, it means rebuke. Okay? Now, when we use the word rebuke, it has a negative connotation, and we think that we're supposed to put people down and tell them you're being bad and so on and so forth. That's not the idea of Mussar. That's not the way it is. What Mussar really is growth. Now, today in the educational world, there's a lot of talk of what's called a growth mindset and encouraging students to care about their own education, becoming better students, becoming better learners, and working on themselves to improve. Now, really, what we have to do in our entire lives, not just as students in a classroom, but as students of life, is have a growth mindset in all areas. Are we patient enough? Are we careful with how we express our anger? Are we careful with how we feel about other people? Are we judgmental to other people? All of those things are under the category of Mussar. And that's something that we really have to focus on. It's a lifelong work. It's not something that we do, go to like the 10-week training course and then we're fixed for life. It doesn't work that way. But what it does do is it kind of gives us a framework of any interaction we have. Let's take a step back. Let's see where we stand and take an understanding of who we are and what we present in any given situation. So race and understanding this country's history is something to realize where there were not such great things that happened within the world of racism and things like that. And what we have to realize is that we need to improve, and something that we can grow on, and something we can take lessons from the past of how we can be better in the future.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, and thank you everybody in our audience for being here. And we hope that the next 4 sessions together are indeed, as Ravi Murgi has said, are ones in which we can really do some deep reflection, self-reflection, thinking about who we are as a country, thinking about who we are as a Jewish people, and what our responsibilities are. We're going to say a little bit more about that in a few moments. I just want to actually introduce myself first, and have Barry introduce herself, and then we'll dive right into our discussion. So my name is Yoni Cadden. My primary job is teacher. I'm a teacher at Gann Academy, which is a high school in Waltham, Massachusetts, one of the suburbs of Boston. It's a non-denominational Jewish high school in which I teach courses on American history, American constitutional law, and I also have led many annual trips to Alabama, to Georgia and Alabama, tracing the history of our civil rights movements in our country, which, as I will probably say many, many times, is both an incredibly moving experience, but also a fraught one. Because when you go to the South and you study the history of civil rights, you go to Birmingham, where the police dogs and the fire hoses, et cetera, happen, or the bridge at Selma, and you see where the beatings happen. It's very easy for us to think that racism was a problem of the past and a problem of the South. And it certainly was a problem of the South, and it certainly was a problem of the past, but it's also a problem of us, and it is a problem of today. And that is a big, that is really in many ways what we're going to be talking about over the course of the next 4 lessons together. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll allow Barry now to introduce herself.
Well, my name is Barry Gilfix, and Yoni and I have been working on this project for about 2 years. And we want to approach the question of racism not as you're a racist, but to understand the unwritten and perhaps not very well thought of how the Jewish community deals with the subject of racism, both as a community and as individuals. The Jewish community has, in 1913, they established an organization called the American Jewish Congress, led by Justice Louis Brandeis. And the premise of the American Jewish Congress was that what is good for everyone is good for the Jews. And that it is important for us to care about what happens to other people, because caring about other people, protecting the rights of others, protects the rights of the Jewish community. We want to look at the issues of racism to try and understand things we may not have thought about, and how we can be more conscious in the Mussar sense, how we can improve ourselves and our community by looking at these issues and finding ways to work with them.
So let's dive in. Well, first, every class will come with a handout, and so I'm going to now send chat to. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so you should see in the chat a link. And that link is to a handout, an electronic version of our handout today. So I'm going to invite everybody to open that and make sure they're able to. You don't need to necessarily use it now. You can have that for later on. I'm also going to project, I'm going to share my screen with you as well. So you'll be able to follow along on the screen as well. So you should be able to see our class projected up here too. So I'll give everybody a minute to just locate that, and then we'll begin. Yeah. Okay. So you will notice at the very top of the handout, there are 4 classes. Today, we're really going to be talking about how cities in the north became segregated, and what choices we have. And that really ultimately is what our class is all about. What does that segregation in our cities, in our towns, our suburbs, etc. What does that have to do with us? That's class 1. I want to say one other thing, and this really is going to frame not only today's class, but the other 4 classes as well. None of what we're going to be learning here is meant to induce guilt. Guilt is not a helpful feeling. In fact, it often leads to paralysis. It leads to people feeling badly and inactive. That would be the worst outcome. Our goal is not to say it is anybody's fault per se, certainly not anybody's fault in the room that we are in today, in our Zoom call and at Adam Street today, but rather the question is, however it happened, what is our responsibility now that it has happened? Now that we are living in a world that has been segregated, now that we're living in a world in which some people have particular privilege, some people have particular power and others do not, what is our responsibility? What do we as human beings, what do we as Jews have to do? And so that really is ultimately going to be what we focus on, which is why we're taking a stance of looking at this through the lens of Mussar, because Mussar helps us, as Ryan and Murgy beautifully pointed out. Mussar helps us to really do that kind of self-reflection that really pushes us to be thinking about what is our responsibility in any given moment, in any given situation, regardless of whose fault it is. So that's going to be class number 1, is thinking about segregation and what it has to do with us. Class 2 is going to be, we're going to be thinking about issues of racial inequality that persist in our communities, and how we might, some examples of that, how we might react to that, and we'll be looking at the Mussar lens of achrayut, responsibility. Class 3, we're going to be looking at stories, hearing the voices of those who have experienced racism in their lives, and listening carefully and really thinking about what it means to be a good listener. And then we're going to be talking about the Mussar concept of the Bechira. So we'll talk about that in our 3rd class, and then finally we'll be looking at a really interesting tool that was developed in the early 80s called the invisible knapsack. And we'll be thinking about the Mussar tool of Hakarat HaTuv. So that will be our 4th class together. So those are the 4 classes. With that said, we're going to dive right in with our class. So we've already heard from Ryan and Murgy. We're going to talk about Mussar and what it means specifically with the Mussar concept of hitlamdut. And this, in many ways, is not only going to frame today's lesson, but really the next 4 or next 3 after this as well. So what does hitlamdut mean? So hitlamdut is the reflexive verb. So Hebrew, like most languages, your verbs can take different forms. This is the reflexive form of the verb lamed mem daled, med, to learn. But it's really, what does it mean for us to learn reflectively, to be thinking, to be thinking about learning and how it impacts us. So the term hitlamdut means to internalize what you learn. A mitlamed, somebody who can see how any particular situation applies to their own life. So that is really what we want to be thinking about. And there are really two ways in which Hitlamdut can occur. The first one, we can see when we practice Hitlamdut, number one, our learning comes alive. Habit and learning by rote undermines spiritual growth. So when we read the Torah portion of the week for the umpteenth time and think, I've read this story about Abraham before and feel nothing new, we are not practicing Hitlamdut. You are, however, a mitlamed, doing Hitlamdut, when you hear the Abraham story again and you see something you never saw before. You see the story with new eyes and realize how a certain detail relates to your life. Such realizations energize us, make the text come alive, and keep us growing. This is one type of Hitlamdut. So I want to just invite everybody tonight and moving forward, if you've heard some of the things that we're talking about tonight, you've heard them before, take a stance of Hitlamdut. What does it mean to hear this story? And what new perspective can I bring to it tonight? So I want to invite you to think about what we're doing with new eyes if what you're hearing is something you've heard before. So that's number one. A second type of Hitlamdut, and this I think for most of us will be true, is a learning of something that you may not have experienced before, but challenges us. So we experience, number two, we experience all kinds of things, good and bad, all day long. Our children don't do what we ask of them. We get an award at work, a store knocks on our electricity for a week. These experiences may not impact us at all. We may take them in stride, or we may explode in anger and then move on. Hitlamdut, or the mitlamed, looks for the learnings in those experiences. My children are listening when I ask them to set the table. What can I learn about myself from this? Maybe I don't speak to them in the right tone. Maybe I need to play with them a little more before dinner time. A mitlamed reads life as learning opportunities. And so I want to stress that this is essential as we're about to dive into some really, really hard history, some hard stories of our past, to be thinking from the stance of Hitlamdut, being a mitlamed. What does it mean to experience something that feels painful, that feels hard, and rather than just feel a negative emotion and move on, but rather to ask, what is it about this that's bothering me? What might I learn from this? What is triggering me right now? So this is our Mussar term of the day, Hitlamdut. I want to invite everybody to think about that. What about tonight is going to be challenging for you? What is forcing you into a stance of self-reflection, or what should force you into a stance of self-reflection? And we're going to return to this as we go through our lesson tonight. We're going to be thinking about that, and at the end of our class tonight, we'll be asking people to reflect on a moment in tonight's class that was challenging. What was something that was hard? What was something that you learned about that really triggered you, pushed a button for you, whatever it is, and then we'll ask people to share that. We'll be asking people to share out throughout our discussion, but certainly that will be thinking about our Mussar lesson as we move through, and then reflecting. We'll circle back later on tonight. So that is what we plan on doing. So that is a framing for tonight. Are there any questions? I want to open the floor to anybody to ask questions or offer observations about the concept from the Mussar tonight. And after that, we can move on. Any thoughts or observations about this stance of learning? There's several people on Zoom just letting you. Okay, so we're going to now begin with one more word of framing, and I'll put our class back up on the screen. So we're on page, for those who are here in person, we're on page 3.
Yoni?
Somebody just said my name.
Yes, Mark.
Yes.
I put a question which
Oh.
doesn't necessarily need an answer, but I was asking the connection between Hitlamdut and social action. Maybe we'll come back.
It's a beautiful question. Yeah, in fact, I think I think that's actually a really good question for everybody to be thinking about. What is the relationship between deep and self-reflective thinking, and you're moving towards action, towards now doing in the world. So I love that question. Thank you for asking it. And we will we can circle back. I think it's a great idea. So I want to ask that everybody take a moment and turn to page 3 or look up on your screen. These are some key vocabulary terms that are often used in discussions about race. I imagine some are going to be new for you. Some may be vocabulary terms that you've seen before. And we're going to ask folks to take a peek at those for a moment. Barry, I think wanted to weigh in with some before you do that. Yes.
When you read these vocabulary words, at some point, perhaps after the class, during the week, that you'll write down some thoughts or feelings that you had when you read these words. What feelings did they evoke? What emotions? I think that we all react to these words in different ways. And I think it will be helpful for you to make notes about how you feel about these words and how they make you feel. It is part of learning, part of the Hitlamdut, and to see, hopefully, if there were things that made you angry or frustrated, or when you said, I don't like that, I don't want to talk about that, that hopefully over the course of the next 4 weeks, that you will develop some new ideas, new thoughts about these words. And by writing down how you're reacting, it will help you to remember and to look back and see how you have changed or grown through that experience.
So we are going to, throughout our course together, going to be looking at many, if not all, but many of these vocabulary terms. I want to make sure that we will keep these front and center as we move through. So if we hit on one, or you're curious about one, would like to explore one as it relates to the classes that we're looking at, that you certainly feel that you have the space to ask, what does this word or term mean? So I want to just pause for a moment and give everybody an opportunity. Does anybody have any questions about any of the vocabulary terms before we move on? Right after we're done looking at some vocabulary, we're going to then start deep diving into history. Yes, Mark.
I notice you have some boldface.
Yes.
You want to what is the
What are the ones that are bold-faced? Yes. So critical race theory and systemic racism are two that we bold-faced. So those are the two that we are going to discuss tonight, and we're going to come back to defining them later. And the reason that we chose them is A, because they relate thematically to the history that we're going to be studying tonight. A, and B, these are two of the hot button terms that get thrown around a lot: critical race theory and systemic racism. I think people hear them. They're used by lots of people in lots of contexts, sometimes correctly, oftentimes incorrectly. And our goal is that, so we'll provide some background as to where these words come from, so you'll know what they mean. And hopefully have a little context to use them correctly and think about them from a Hitlamdut perspective. What do these words have to do with me? So, Mark, we're going to come back to the defining them, but that's why they are bold. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. So let's dive into some of the history. Barry and I spent quite a bit of time thinking about which history we really wanted to explore. And in the history of race and racism in this country, there are so many places that we could look. We could look at economic disparities. We could look at the treatment of the Black body, by police, by many instances, other areas of society. We could talk about culture. We specifically, though, chose to think about segregation. Partly because it's something that is common, something we can see, something that is the case in most neighborhoods throughout our country, and is one that I think is getting a lot of attention. And so we really wanted to, we chose to delve into this with the giant caveat that there are so many points of history that we could be studying. This is the one we are going to be studying tonight, is the history of segregation in our country. So Just to let you know how this handout is organized. So every page has on the left side is a timeline that moves chronologically, vertically from top to bottom to hopefully situate what we're looking at. And it's the parts that are bolded are the parts that are on this particular page of what we're going to be talking about. And that is the specific thing we're talking about is on the right. So we're going to start our story of segregation in American neighborhoods with the Great Migration. So what is the Great Migration? First, a little background. The Great Migration was a long time coming, really after the emancipation of America's 4 million enslaved people. So in 1865, there were 4 million people who had been enslaved in this country in America's southern states. After the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, it frees the enslaved people. The question is what would come next? What sorts of opportunities would be there for them? Would the country now provide for them economic opportunity, political opportunity? And for a short period of time during what became known as Reconstruction between 1865 and 1877, in many ways flawed for sure, fell short absolutely, but in many important ways, opportunities were in fact provided for formerly enslaved people. For example, over 2,000 formerly enslaved people served in government. And we're not just talking about like local city or state governments, we're talking about US senators, Congress people, the governors of some of these states that had formerly enslaved, Mississippi, etc. And they are also judges. They're sitting as the secretaries of state, meaning as we now know from the 2020 election, these are the people who oversee elections, enormously powerful positions. 2,000 formerly enslaved people hold those positions. So that's one area of enormous opportunity. Economically, I'll just give you one more example. Formerly enslaved people are able to acquire land, and in some cases, hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. It wasn't easy. It wasn't like it was given to them. There were promises that were made. 40 acres and a mule is the most famous example of the American government saying, we're going to give you land and property afterwards. It doesn't happen. But the resilience and also in many ways the know-how of the formerly enslaved, the formerly enslaved knew their plantations, knew the land, knew how to farm better than the vast majority of white people because they were the ones who were working the land, were able to successfully plant and thus harvest and make some money to acquire land. This is not to say all of them. Many of them end up in oppressive systems where they become sharecroppers, where they're stuck in a cycle of lending money and not being able to pay it back, and then having to constantly pay back enormous amounts of money to the white landowners. But many Black people were actually able to acquire land. So that's the story really of the post-Civil War for many Black people there. Political opportunity, economic opportunity. And then things start to really fall apart in the late 1800s. The federal government steps out. They no longer are going to protect voting rights of Black people. They're no longer going to ensure the economic sustenance of new Black landowners. And through all sorts of devices, white people start to reclaim the southern states, and they call themselves redeemers, very biblically thinking of themselves as redeeming proper political control, redeeming the land. In fact, they're stealing this idea of land redemption, Shemitah. We're going to redeem what had rightfully before been owned by white people. They come up with all sorts of backhanded tax schemes. Forcing people to sign contracts they didn't know what they were signing, that ends up giving back land, and slowly but surely land that had been acquired, political power that had been accrued is now, it doesn't happen overnight, but within a few decades shift back from the formerly enslaved to the white population. And it's all reinforced by a system of physical oppression, lynching. And between the late 1800s and the 1940s, well over 4,000 people that we've documented, were lynched in the South, were murdered. This is the original terrorism of the modern period, begins in America. KKK and others will reinforce all of these political and economic oppressions through physical violence. All that while the vast majority of Black people are still stuck in the South. Why are they stuck in the South? They're stuck in the South largely because there are no opportunities in the North. They would desperately like to go up to the North. They would like to perhaps work in some of the newly opening factories that are happening, opened by Andrew Carnegie producing steel, or the train magnates that are now setting up railroads. They would love to go up and work in those industries. Rockefeller's oil companies happily take jobs there. The problem is they are not letting Black people take those jobs. Those jobs are being filled primarily by immigrants. We're talking, immigrants that are coming over from Italy, coming over from Ireland, many of our ancestors coming over from Russia, exactly, Eastern Europe. And so, there is no space for Black people to move up there, and there is no invitation from these factories for Black people. And so they are largely stuck on land that is not theirs, where they are in a cycle of debt, where they are desperately trying to plant, but never making enough off of what they're planting, and they're constantly having to pay back, and they're stuck on that land with no place to go. What changes that, and here's where we pick up on the story of the Great Migration, what changes that are two major events of the early 20th century. The first is xenophobia. You have this outbreak. It's not really new, but it's by outbreak, I mean a surge of xenophobia. There had long been a fear of Chinese immigrants that goes back to the 1880s, where they exclude Chinese immigrants, and now there's going to be a restriction on European immigrants as well. Correct, exactly. And so by 1924, the doors are almost entirely shut, but even before then, they're being shut even more, largely because of World War I. Now, World War I, because immigration is being shut, there's not a whole lot of people moving around during the war, and also a great need for people to come work in factories that are producing the arms for American fighting in World War, not just American, but also arms being supplied to the Allies. Factories desperately need people. The immigrants that had previously been the workers in those factories are no longer coming into the country. These factories desperately need people to work in them. And so they turn to the one source of labor that is available and willing to move into those jobs, Black people from the South. And they start picking up and moving in enormous numbers. So what I'm going to invite people to do just for a moment is to take a look at what happens as a result of Black people now moving into cities throughout the North. So on page 4, thank you, yeah, and also on the screen in front of you are a map showing where they go and some statistics. So I'm going to invite you guys to just take a look at the stats. Anything that jumps out, anything that seems interesting, curious, you have a question about or want to observe, love to hear your thoughts on what you see in front of you.
Well, one point is that, although you don't see it clearly on the map, is that the way people get north is on the railroads. So people from Georgia tend to end up on the East Coast, and people from Mississippi tend to end up in Chicago, because that's where the railroad goes. So that it influences not just the people who are moving, but how they're going to get there and where they end up.
Correct. Yep. So the railroads, and also the fact that it's the factories that are largely in right at this point in history in either the East Coast or in the Midwest, Chicago, Detroit, etc., will influence that. And that's why you have that darker green color is the earlier wave of immigration. And when the Sun Belt opens, the West and the factories there, and also exactly right, Barry says transportation is now available, that you're going to see in the second wave where the factories and transportation are available for the West, that formerly that Black people and ancestors of the formerly enslaved will now move out west to California and points in the west of the country. So what else do you notice? And you can either focus on the map or on the statistics of immigration.
It's amazing looking at the numbers for Chicago. Both Chicago has that's an enormous increase. I'm not sure if that's just the transportation node and other reasons.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So what does it mean? So you look at Chicago, that goes from approximately in 1910, 58,000 Black people to 346,000 in the course of one generation. What percentage, you're more of a mathematician than I am. I'll let you figure out exactly what the math is, the percent increase that represents, but it is enormous. New York goes from 142,000 to 661,000, 519,000 more people in the course of 30 years. What are the impacts going to be on a community when that happens, particularly a community that had not really had a tremendous number of people of color living there? Absolutely. Other things that you may observe.
Looking at Cleveland, well, looking at Boston, there isn't
Yes.
nearly as much population explosion as places
Absolutely.
like Cleveland or Pittsburgh or New York.
Yep. So Mark, I'm so glad that you just noticed that. In fact, if you were going to look at percent increase or even just numerical increase, Boston is at the very bottom of the list. And so the question is why? So I'll give you a very quick overview as to why now, but this is really in many ways a story about Boston. Yes, in the United States, about race and racism in the country as a whole, but also in our fair city. And so we'll really delve into that a lot more as we go through our next classes together. But I'll just say right now that Boston was notoriously at this point in time, and in many ways even today, a city not welcoming to outsiders. Not just to Black people, but to outsiders in general. It's a very insular city. And so what happens with a lot of these places is they begin to get reputations. Oh, this is a place where you can go and get, live in a neighborhood that's welcoming, that's open, or at least there's quite a few Black people that will welcome you in, you'll be able to find a job, etc. Boston was not one of those places. Notoriously hard to break into. We'll delve more into that, why that is the case, what the history of that is, but you're exactly right, Mark, to notice that Boston is historically an insular city. Yeah.
And that is partly also because Boston had experienced a tremendous influx of Irish people who, although they spoke English, were very much looked down upon.
Yes.
And this carried over into how, at that point in time, what we would now call the Yankees, that didn't want anybody to come in. They were perfectly happy with themselves.
Yep.
And so they didn't like the Irish, who came in enormous numbers to Boston. They were not happy with the Jews, who were coming in large numbers to Boston. They were not happy with the French Canadians taking advantage of the railroads from Quebec to bring them into Boston. So Black people were very visible, but they were not the only people suffering from the kind of prejudice, if you will, that Boston exuded.
Correct. Yeah. I'll just tell one very quick story about this, and then we're going to move on to what this all has to do with segregation. Because we're not seeing the segregation quite yet. That's going to come in a moment. I took a group to the south. I've told you, I'll tell you stories about that as we go through our classes together. And one of the things I remember most is we were visiting my group of students, and I were visiting with a local judge in Montgomery. Her name is Vanzetta McPherson. She's a remarkable leader of civil rights today. And the kids were talking about civil rights in the South and the history of race and racism in Alabama. And she just paused and she said, "Mommy, where are you from again?" They said, "Boston." I have a question for you. And she asked the kids, "Do you know within the civil rights communities?" And she knows, I mean, she is like in the fore of the civil rights community today. So do you know which city in this country has by far, and it's agreed upon unequivocally, the worst reputation for being the most racist city in the entire country? And all of the kids, yes, they said Jackson, Montgomery, Birmingham. They said, no, none of them. They're not great, but not even close. Everybody knows it's Boston. And the kids looked shocked and horrified, and that really became, in many ways, the core theme of the rest of our trip. What does that mean? First of all, why was that so upsetting to you? And how could that be? And then what does that then mean for us in terms of what we need to do. What does that Hitlam do to this self-exploration, exactly as Mark Stettner asked before, now have to do with social action? You're going to take this back to Boston. What does this have to do with us? So with that, I want to tell one very quick story about the Great Migration, because I think that history can be abstract, and looking at individual stories can help bring it to life and make it personal in a way. So I want to read one quick story about the Great Migration. What was the experience of the Great Migration? Because we tend to think of it as this sort of like incredibly heroic moment where Black people, and it was, and by the way, this is one of the greatest protest movements of all time, the Great Migration. And one of the greatest revolutions of American history, this migration. And it's also numerically one of the largest, in fact, I think demographically may be in this amount of time, the biggest human migration in certainly in American history, if not in global history as well. But in any event, let's look at it from the eyes of one person, one boy, because I think that that really will help to bring it to life, and because it's not easy for anybody at all. So here's the story of one person, as told by Isabel Wilkerson. So if you don't know who Isabel Wilkerson, she's one of the great journalists / historians of race history in America. She wrote a wonderful book called Caste, and before that, I think actually even more wonderful book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the Great Migration. So here's the story that she tells. A little boy, we're on page 5, a little boy boarded a northbound train with his grandmother and extended family, along with her upright piano, yes, and so how you get that onto a train is a whole other story, and the rest of their worldly possessions stuffed inside wooden crates to begin their journey out of Mississippi. It was 1935. They were packed into the Jim Crow car, which was, by custom, at the front of the train, the first to absorb the impact in the event of a collision. Little details we don't think about the Jim Crow segregation law, but that's one of them. They would not be permitted into the dining cars, and they carried fried chicken and boiled eggs to tide them over for the journey. That's something you hear Black people talk about all the time when you travel through the segregated South. Food. You always had to think about food long in advance, otherwise you were not going to get fed. And the bathroom. That was another huge question too, for another time. The little boy, paragraph 2, the little boy was 4 years old and anxious. He overheard the grown-ups talking about leaving their farm in Arcabotla to start over up north. He heard them say they might leave him with his father's people who he didn't know. In the end, they took him along. Their near abandonment haunted him. He missed his mother, who would not be joining them on this journey. She was away trying to make a stable life for herself after the breakup with his father. And he didn't know when he would see her again. This is common throughout the Great Migration. His family's just being torn asunder. We have no choice. If we're going to create a better life for our children, we need to send our 4-year-olds by themselves. Not uncommon. His grandfather had preceded them north. He was a hardworking, serious man who kept the indignities he suffered under Jim Crow to himself. In Mississippi, he had not dared stand up to some white children who broke the family's wagon. He told the little boy that as Black people, they had no say in that world. These are like the little stories of Jim Crow that you never hear about, but are so deeply impactful. There were things they could do that we couldn't, including breaking other people's toys with impunity. The boy would say of the white children when he was a grown man with gray hair and a son of his own. The grandfather was so determined to get his family out of the South that he bought a plot of land sight unseen in a place called Michigan. On the trip north, the little boy and his cousins and uncles and aunts, who were children themselves, did not quite know what Michigan was, so they made a ditty out of it and sang as they waited for the train, meat skin, we're going to meat skin. They landed on freer soil, but between the fears of abandonment and the trauma of being uprooted from his mother, the little boy arrived with a stutter. Everybody in his family said he did not have it before. This was trauma. This is PTSD. He began to speak less and less. At Sunday school, the children bellowed with laughter whenever he tried. So instead, he talked to the hogs and the cows and the chickens on the farm, who he said years later, don't care how you sound. The little boy went mute for 8 years. He wrote down the answers to questions he was asked, fearing even to introduce himself to strangers, until a high school English teacher coaxed him out of his silence by having him read poetry aloud to the class. He would go on to the University of Michigan, where he abandoned pre-med for theater. The young man was James Earl Jones. I love this story for so many reasons. First of all, it has a tremendous ending. You have insight into somebody we all know. Darth Vader apparently was a migrant along with the rest of his community during the Great Migration. It humanizes the story, it's memorable, but it also just, I think it gets at what did it mean to be on this migration? What did it mean to be a 4-year-old, in many cases younger, sometimes older, whatever it was, that sometimes you were lucky enough to have a teacher who coaxed you out of your stutter or your mutedness. How many others didn't though? How many others didn't? And these are the hidden stories of the Great Migration. Sometimes it led to great success, but so many other times it didn't. But in any event, this is the story of millions and millions of human beings in this country, and now takes us to the story of segregation in our country. So I'm going to pause and just ask, are there any questions or observations about the Great Migration before we look at what it meant to be a migrant in the North? And that's where we start to see the segregation parts.
Yoni,
Yes.
doesn't August Wilson, the playwright, write about the impact of the migration in some of his works?
Yes. In fact, yes. So go ahead, Barry. You're going to comment. Yeah. No, indeed, he does. In fact, the Great Migration is a cornerstone of so many stories. Raisin in the Sun, it talks about that. There's lots and lots of stories. But yes, August Wilson, fences, etc. Still looking at Pittsburgh, etc. I think it's one of the great stories of the Great Migration. So yes, indeed, yes, it is one of the central stories of the 20th century in America. Okay, so what is the impact? The impact on northern cities was enormous, and I want to focus on one, and that is housing. It was about the 1930s. We now have hundreds of thousands of migrants coming into northern cities, and was for many, many white people a source of concern. We're going to come back to that in a moment. We'll talk about what that source of concern looked like in a few moments. I want to just pause to look at another event of the 1930s happening simultaneous to the Great Migration was the Great Depression. So as you may know, in 1929, the stock market crashes. It's not the cause of, but it's certainly in many ways the precipitant of the Great Depression. Two greats, I guess, that are happening in a century of greatness in many ways: the Great Migration, the Great Depression, and people throughout the country throughout the Great Depression lose their jobs. Unemployment is, in some cases, it's hard to really measure these things because unemployment only measures people who are actually looking for jobs. The vast majority of the country gave up. So probably 50–60% of the country is unemployed. So people cannot now pay their mortgages anymore. They can't pay for housing. And it's causing a major collapse in the real estate market. So for those of you who remember 2008, it's looking on top of already the depressed market. Housing and real estate crashes are a big part of the problem. And the federal government says, well, we have two problems going on right now with this housing collapse. First of all, people are homeless. That's a huge human problem. And we have a huge economic problem. Can we solve this with some kind of government action? And what they come up with was a program that would change the housing industry in this country forever. What did they do? Okay, a little bit of history. Hopefully it won't be too boring because we're going to talk a little bit about mortgages, but this is how a person prior to anybody who owns a home, you'll appreciate this. Prior to what the government does during the Great Depression, prior to 1934, in order for you to buy a home, you had to put down a huge part of the down payment up front, sometimes 30–40% of the house. That's unheard of today. Very few people had that kind of money. So you had to save up a huge portion of your income to pay for that house up front, and then you had to pay it off in 10 years. Also unheard of. Those people get 30 years to pay it off, but banks were not willing to take that kind of risk. Who's going to have a job for 30 years? Who's going to have income? We don't want to take that kind of risk. 10 years. So what we're talking really is very few people, only about 30% of Americans own a house in 1930. Tiny percent, because nobody could afford it. The government now says we are going to try to change the real estate market in 1934, put people back into the homes they owned, and hopefully put more people back into the homes and get the economy going through the real estate market by the following government action. The government says this. We will back, they tell this to banks. Banks, if you start giving out more generous loans, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, you start giving out more generous loans, and we will back up those loans with government money. If somebody defaults on the loan, we will pay you back. And they create something called the Federal Housing Administration to set up that program. It does a lot of things. This is one of them, but that's one of the big programs. And so what they tell banks is if you give out loans where people don't have to put down 30, 40%, they can put down 10% or even less. Give them a 30-year loan. That'll get people into houses, it'll get the real estate market going again. And you banks don't have to worry about people defaulting on those mortgages because we will pay you back if they do. You're covered. And so the banks say, great, fabulous. And they start giving out mortgages. And starting in 1934, people are either able to stay in the homes, they're able to refinance their mortgages and stay in their homes, or new people are now able to get into homes. And by 1960, only 25 years later, it goes from 30% of Americans owning their homes to 60% of Americans owning their homes. And that's fabulous for many, many Americans. And it leads to a huge housing boom right after the war. And you can see remarkable images of that happening here on, oh, sorry, I had to change the page. On page 7, this had been,
Before you get to that, you
Yeah.
need to mention that FAA mortgage, federal FHA mortgages were not available to Black.
Oh, we are gonna get there, not to worry,
Oh,
that's a
okay.
big part of our story, absolutely, absolutely, yes. So, this image of what's it's called Levittown, is named after the businessman named Levitt, who set up this is entirely a potato field prior to 1947, and he takes all these huge pieces of farmland in New York and Pennsylvania, et cetera, and they start building prefab suburbs that any American, now with the new FHA loans, who could get those loans, and Barry will come to that in a second, could purchase. And that was terrific for many, but not for everybody. And here's why. So let's jump to page 9. So the federal government, and here's where it gets tricky, and I want to be actually very clear about this, because this will open a debate as to whether or not this was predicated on economics or racism, or maybe both. The federal government wants to make sure that it's not going to be covering loans that were made without really the bank, they don't want the bank, I'll say it differently, they don't want the bank just giving out loans to anybody, because if the banks are going to constantly be defaulting, the federal government's going to be drowning in debt that they have to now pay back to the banks. So they set up what's called an underwriter's manual. The FHA that creates what's called an underwriting manual. They give instructions to the banks. They say, we will only pay back your loans if you give loans under the following conditions. And so here is one set of instructions. There were many, but here is one of the ones that is most common. So again, I want to remind everybody, this was written at the bottom of page 9, was written by the federal government as instructions to the banks. These are the people that you should or should not give loans to. Areas, they write, bottom of page 9, areas surrounding a location are to be investigated to determine whether incompatible racial and social groups are present for the purpose of making a prediction regarding the probability of the location being invaded by such groups. A change in social or racial occupancy generally contributes to instability and a decline in values.
Please underline the word invaded.
So what does that mean?
Yes.
What is the federal government's very complicated government slash economic speak? What does this mean? What is the government saying, FHA?
I think the key word is invaded.
Why do you say that?
Well, you might say, we'll make a prediction regarding the probability of the location being more interesting to people of certain groups. The very use of the word is a very powerful indication of what they are thinking. And then the next sentence, the change in racial occupancy generally contributes to a decline in values. The assumption made by the government that if Black people move into a neighborhood, they have invaded the neighborhood, and then the properties will be worth less money.
So what is the government effectively, putting into layman's terms, what is the government effectively telling banks?
But don't go into Black people.
Because if you lend to Black people,
It will contribute to instability and a decline in values. The assumption being if Black people move into the neighborhood, there goes the neighborhood.
so I want to just be clear, this was not based on evidence. This was based on assumptions,
Based on racism.
based on racist assumptions about Black people paying back loans. They were,
No, it was more about what would happen to a neighborhood if Black people moved in.
or then it would lead to a decline in the neighborhood and property values would decline and thus make the house worth less money. And then the banks lose their money and the federal government is on the hook for that too. So all of these are factors in it as well. So what the banks do is they take these instructions and they pay cartographers, map makers, to draw maps, to go around and figure out which neighborhoods are, quote, the safe neighborhoods, which neighborhoods are the ones that are okay, and which are the neighborhoods in decline or already off limits. Because they, quote, as Barry said, or as pointed out in the FHA's language, have already been invaded. And so generally the maps would take on the following colors. So you can see, I'll make it a little bigger for you on the screen here, the dark green colors here, we're looking at the Boston map. The dark green neighborhoods are the ones that are doing fine, give them loans. Blue is okay, not as good, but still you can give them loans. Yellow, a little bit more hazardous. Red are the ones that you do not lend to. So if you're going to move into a neighborhood, you darn well better be moving into one of the neighborhoods that are blue or green. And of course, the problem was that real estate agents were not willing to sell Black people houses in the blue or the green because they believed that that would depress the neighborhood. So they'd only sell them houses in the red neighborhood. The problem is if you're a Black person moving into the red neighborhood, you couldn't get yourself a loan. We'll talk about how they do get loans in a few moments, but that creates deeply problematic situations in housing because people are unable to really get stable loans into those houses. And that is where the term redlining comes from. The federal government literally told the banks, draw lines around your neighborhoods to discern the good and, quote, bad neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods that were predominantly lived in by Black people were drawn with red ink, hence redlining. Any questions about that? Yeah.
So how does that, if you think about it today, how does that impact African-American home ownership and white home ownership?
The fabulous question. So I don't know if everybody heard Barry's question. What does that do with us today and who lives where and both in terms of where they live and also in terms of the quality of homes today, et cetera. I think that's a fair characterization of the question. It's exactly we're going to be aiming towards that. There's a few more pieces of the puzzle that we're going to get to, and then we're going to answer exactly that question. And then we're going to think about people on what does it do with us? So that's precisely where we're going. Exactly right. Thank you.
Another question.
Yes, please.
So I have relatives, as perhaps some or many of you do, who lived in Dorchester and Roxbury
Yes.
in the early and middle part of the 20th century. And I know Willa Levine has written about it, but how did the policy impact Jews?
Yeah, it's a great question. As you rightly point out, this is the 1930s, is really the height of Jewish life in Dorchester and Roxbury. It's where, you go down Blue Hills Avenue, it's where most of the synagogues, I mean, Adams Street is an outlier. We're here in Newton. The vast majority of synagogues that are today in either Brookline or Newton were actually then in Rochester and Dorchester, Dorchester and Roxbury, which are the south areas here, which are some are in green, some are in yellow. They are, how does it impact them? For now, when this map is drawn in the 1930s, they are able to get loans, they're doing okay, but those red lines would extend further and further south. And we'll talk about how it happens in Boston. There's actually a particular way in which those neighborhoods that had previously been blue or green or yellow for Jews get broken up and turned red. And so we're going to look at that a little later. So that's part of our story, Mark. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. I want to look because I want to be mindful of our time, and I'm going to take too much more. I think that an hour and 15 is probably we'll go another 15 more minutes to tell the rest of our story. So if you turn to the next page, to page 10, the federal government further goes on, and this is another part of the story. It's not just about drawing red lines to ensure that loans only go to certain neighborhoods. They also tell loan agents, banks, to ensure that when you build suburbs, that you do so, if you look at the very top of the page, with carefully compiled zoning regulations. They tell suburbs, make sure that when you build property, that each house has a lot of land. Don't keep those houses close together. Every house gets a large plot of land. Why? Because those are really expensive houses. You keep them single family, you keep them expensive, and people only then with money can buy them. Much harder to buy a house that has a lot of property. So zoning regulations will keep them at high property value and also keep quote the right people in and the quote wrong people out. And then finally, recorded deed restrictions. So what is a deed restriction? They're saying, please, houses have deed restrictions. Banks, please loan only to people with deed restrictions. I'll invite everybody to turn to page 11. And so here is a typical deed restriction. So basically, what is a deed restriction? Every piece of property comes with a set of regulations that you are and are not allowed to do with that piece of property. So for example, I know in my particular deed restriction, we have a whole other look at it, a lot of fun. Certain things you're not allowed to do on my property. According to my deed restrictions, we can't have a foundry on my property. We're not allowed to, iron works, not allowed. We are required, we have a road that we have to keep open access to our neighbor. That's also in our deed restrictions. So we have certain regulations that are required. So to our house. Most houses, most pieces of property have that. Here is typical deed restriction language from Seattle, but they existed throughout Boston as well. No person or persons, top of page 11, of Asiatic, African, or Negro blood lineage or extraction shall be permitted to occupy a portion of said property. Meaning that you, when you sell this house, are not allowed to sell this house to a Black person. Between 1946 and 48, J. Gordon and A. Schneidler subdivided and sold more than a dozen lots. Each deed of sale includes the following restriction: that said property shall not be resold, leased, rented, or occupied except to or by persons of the Aryan race. And by the way, that is in 46 and 48. I kept the dates in there just so you can contextualize that word Aryan. Yes, Barry, I see your faces recognize that word. This is not before the Nazis. This is after the Nazis that they're using that kind of language. Absolutely. So just to give you a sense, the practice was so widespread that by 1940, 80% of property in Chicago and Los Angeles carried restrictive covenants barring Black families. And that was to a large degree going back to page 10, because the government said recorded deed restrictions should strengthen and supplement zoning ordinances. They were telling banks and property owners and people who built housing and created deeds that if you want loans from us, this is how you're going to get them. Big properties, with deed restrictions only in particular non-red neighborhoods. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna move forward. We're gonna move forward. Okay. So, now,
Page 15.
I want to start looking at how this, because Barry asked exactly the right question. How does this impact neighborhoods today? So I want to talk about what, if you can't get a loan from a bank, how did the typical great migrant family get a loan? Many of them, turn, if you would, to page 13. Get their loans through something called contract buying. Bank won't give you a loan, so how do you get a loan? You get it through the homeowner, the person who owns the home, or somebody who does it on behalf of the home. So they'll sell you the house, and you'll pay them back, but the interest rates are not regulated by the bank, they're not regulated by the government, they can have exorbitant interest rates. And in a contract sale, so if you look under the box, on the top of the page 13, in a contract sale, the seller keeps the deed until the contract is paid in full, and unlike with a normal mortgage, the purchaser acquires no equity in the meantime. You don't own any percent of the house until you pay the whole thing off. If the purchaser misses a single payment, if they miss a single payment, he or she immediately forfeits their 1,000 money down, all their monthly payments, and the property itself. You lose everything. The seller keeps all of the accrued profits and sells the house to another Black family, repeating the cycle. So what does that practically mean? It means that between 75 and 95% of the homes sold to Black families during the 1950s and 1960s were sold on contracts. It were overwhelming numbers. The price markup on homes, and because you can do this, you can mark up the prices in the house 84%. So what that means is that, for example, in Chicago, if you buy or purchase the home by a speculator for $12,000, you could resell it. That speculator could resell it for $22,000. The level of desperation is through the roof. And so sellers are making enormous profits off of this. African Americans who buy on contract pay on average an additional $587 more a month than in a conventional mortgage. So adjusted for inflation, a Black contract buyer in Chicago ends up paying an average of $71,000 more from their home than they would have paid with a conventional mortgage. So that means that in Chicago, Black people had to pay a total of $3.2 billion to $4 billion more for their homes. Why do we care about that? We care about that because of this story on the next page, on page 14. So this was written by somebody who studies professionally the results of contract buying. And she, in fact, is the daughter of Mark Satter, Professor Satter, and her father, Mark, represented people who were in default of their contract. So here's what she wants. Because Black contract buyers knew how easily they could lose their homes, they struggled to make their inflated monthly payments. Husbands and wives both work double shifts. They neglect basic maintenance. They subdivide their apartments, cram in extra tenants, and when possible, charge their tenants hefty rents. White people observed that their new Black neighbors overcrowded and neglected their properties. Overcrowded. So for those who have wondered why the neighborhoods look the way they do, this is why. Overcrowded neighborhoods meant overcrowded schools. In Chicago, officials responded by double shifting the students, half attending in the morning, half in the afternoon. Children were deprived of a full day of schooling and left to fend for themselves in the after-school hours. These conditions helped fuel the rise of gangs, which in turn terrorized shop owners and residents alike. In the end, whites flee the neighborhoods, not only because of the influx of Black families, but also because they were upset about overcrowding, decaying schools, and crime. But Black contract buying did not have the buyers did not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date. Whites could leave, Blacks had to stay. And so redlining leads to contract buying. Contract buying leads to people unable to pay for much else other than their mortgages, which means the houses begin to decay. They can't pay for health insurance. They can't oftentimes pay for groceries. They have to take in enormous numbers of people to help pay the rent with them or the mortgage with them. that leads to overcrowding, and that causes all sorts of other downstream effects. And so one of the reasons that Barry and I decided we were going to talk about segregation in American cities is because it's not just simply about where people live, but it's the impact of all of that on the lives that people live in those neighborhoods. So redlining has all of those downstream effects. I want to pause just for a moment. Any questions or observations or anything? We're going to get to one last piece before we close out.
Have you answered your questions so far at all? Do you want to add anything to your questions or? Okay.
Yeah.
An amazing percentage, 75 to 95% homes sold to Black families in the, that post-war boom, 50s and 60s under contract, such a,
If you want to talk just very briefly, in Newton, after the war, the federal government wanted to build housing for returning veterans. And they built an area in Newton called Oak Park Village, which was available to veterans with very, very low mortgage payments, and it was completely segregated. Blacks were not allowed to live there.
I have two family members who did live there. They were Jewish veterans, they did not. Yep. But that makes sense, because I remember going to the neighborhoods even in the 70s, and I grew up in that neighborhood, or near that neighborhood.
Right.
We're going to talk a lot more about Boston in future classes. It's just setting up. I'm glad you said that, because that actually anticipates where we're going. So I want to tell one more quick story. Actually, Mark asked what happened to Boston itself, to Roxbury and Dorchester, two of the prominent neighborhoods in the Boston area. So this is actually what happens specifically in Boston. So Boston had been, just to remind everybody, had been redlined, and so if you want to take a peek back at the map, it's on it's back on page, I believe, what is it, on page 9. So for those of you who can see it on your screen, and so what starts to happen is that real estate agents realize that there are actually vulnerable homes in these redlined areas that people were having real trouble paying back, and they could buy those homes at hyperinflated prices, and then quickly restore those homes and sell them off to other people, white people specifically, and make a lot of money off those redlined neighborhoods. And so we'll talk about what happens to the Black people who live in those neighborhoods, and specifically what happens in those neighborhoods. Is that Black people get moved around, and then the real estate agents figure out that they actually were going to make a lot more money reselling those homes back to Black people. And so they start kicking out white people. How can we get white people to leave their neighborhoods to sell them to Black people so we can then hyperinflate and contract sell? So how are they getting white people out of the neighborhoods to expand Black people to contract buy? They do it through something called block busting. And so they start expanding into what had previously been, as Mark said, the Roxbury, Dorchester neighborhoods where Jews had lived, to get to expand contract buying into those neighborhoods. And here's what it looks like. Here's what block busting looks like. So if we turn now to page 15, we'll read. This is from an article in 1987, a real estate agent talking about what the block busting in Boston looked like. Okay, I first heard about block busting when I decided I wanted to buy and sell property in Dorchester. So I went to a local real estate agents, and I got friendly with one fellow who worked in a particular office. We went out to lunch a couple of times, and he said, "I like you. You ought to come here to work. You can make a ton of money." He explained to me that the banks had decided to take a certain area and designate it with a red pen, Mattapan and parts of Dorchester. We're going to finance minorities in this particular area so they can get a house with no money down. And this is all the contract buying that we were just talking about. That's how it all began. Of course, I personally wasn't out to help any minorities. I was out to make a buck for myself, and seeing all those clients lining up out the door, I thought a fortune was certainly there. For a lot of people already in the business, it was a boon to them. And a lot of people who weren't in the business said, "Gee, this looks really good. The big area at the time was River Street, Mattapan, back towards Woodhaven, Colorado, Alabama Street. If anybody knows the Boston area, those were largely where the Jews lived. The whole area was primarily a Jewish community. And they were all newer homes. They were affluent people. For living in the city of Boston, they were mostly people who owned their own small businesses. They weren't filthy rich, but they weren't hurting either. And that's more or less where it began. After a while, it expanded. The banks didn't expand the area, the brokers did. We were told you get the listings any way you can. It's pretty easy to do. Just scare the hell out of them. And that's what we did. We were not only making money, we were having fun doing what we were doing. We all liked selling real estate, if you want to call what we were doing back then selling real estate. And it got to a point that to have fun while we were working, we would try to outdo each other with the most outlandish threats that people would believe and chuckle about them at the end of the day. So the milder things were property values are going down. You're going to get $1,000 less the next month than this. Market values really didn't decline that much. They did decline slightly, but the $1,000 a month or whatever figure you picked, that was something you pulled out of thin air. We weren't subtle about it, he goes on. You'd say, how would you like it if they raped your daughter or they got a mulatto grandchild? I remember one particular family where this little girl was about 12 years old and blonde. She was a very pretty little kid. I used that one on them and it did sway them. They sure as hell sold. I even used it once on a son. The little boy would get raped. Whatever worked, I would try to use. The office I worked in had 10 full-time salespeople, and I would say 7 of us did it. The other 3, if they did do it, they were quite upset about it. They were quiet about it. They were quiet about it. There was one fellow, he was such a nice guy, he wouldn't do it at all. He didn't make the big cash the others did. He had direct contact with people who were more blatant than I had direct contact with people who were more blatant than I ever dreamed of being. There were instances of house breaks that were arranged only to scare people out. That was the worst. I thought that was a bit much. I don't think anybody to this day is aware that anybody arranged this. Nobody was arrested for it, convicted, or anything else. Under these federal programs, many of the buyers shouldn't have owned a house. Anyone who didn't have any equity in a house is a high risk. I've sold houses to people who never made a first payment. Why should they? It never cost them to get in. In some cases, the seller paid the closing cost, the first year insurance, and moving costs. It cost them nothing to move in, so they just waited for foreclosure. What we did back then, I don't really consider that bad. We hurt people who were asking to be hurt. They were bigoted and they were asking for everything they got. It was their idea to run. We fueled the fire. In my own defense, I lived in Dorchester and sold the house next door to a black family, and then I lived there for the next 5 years. The black family left though after the white kids in the neighborhood got together and stoned their house night after night. Stonings happen so often that if I had a choice, I'd say to the buyer, let's take your car, not mine. I would tell them it was broken or out of gas. The car would get stoned about once a week, more often than we were in it, more often when we were in it, but occasionally when we were. Kids would look at the car and see a whole family of black people and one white guy in a suit and a tie and a clipboard, and they knew what was going on. Whole areas went from white to black in a matter of months. Then I'm retired now and enjoying it very much. I look back and I realize I've mellowed it in my retirement. So that is how much of Boston, which had been largely Jewish, largely white,
Parts.
much of it, correct? Yep.
In Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, in the real estate ads, they were the ads might say this is in such and such Catholic parish, meaning that it was an Irish neighborhood. Or it would have some other code word to describe it as a Jewish neighborhood. And the Jewish neighborhoods, for some reason, were targeted faster than the Irish neighborhoods.
Yeah, there's been a couple of really interesting books about that. Mark Stettler mentioned one of them, written by Will Levine, about the move of the white Jews of Boston out, why that happened, and another book by Gerald Gann actually asks the question that you're referring to: why did the Jews leave but the Catholics stay? And that's actually a really interesting question, having a lot to do with the anchoring of the Catholic churches, where the Jews tend to be a much more migrant people. It's for another story. But as you can see here on page 17, this is a typical sort of image. This is from the Saturday Evening Post. And I'll let you read the caption under the photo. This is a common, so it's called blockbusting, where contract buying real estate agents realize there's a ton of money to be made off of selling homes to black people. by chasing out white people. And so that is another part of the story. So in our next classes, we're going to talk a lot about what this all looks like today. This is the history of how we got in many ways to our neighborhoods looking the way they do. And so what is the impact on everyday lives of people as a result of that segregation? As you could see, it spills over into so many other areas. It spills over into what sort of wealth you can accrue long term. It spills over into what kind of educational system you're going to have, et cetera. And what if your educational system is overcrowded? What does that mean for your future? Those are really important questions, and we're going to address those next time. So I'm going to invite everybody to just be thinking about this as we move forward into our next classes. And keep thinking about how has this impacted your own, like, has there been anything tonight that has been hard for you to hear? And what are you thinking about as a result of learning these things? That is what Keep Love asks us to do.
I am looking forward next week. I hope you will have comments about the vocabulary section to share your reaction to the vocabulary words, what kind of emotions and ideas those words called up in your mind. And I hope you'll be willing to share those ideas with us.
Absolutely. And so for those of you who showed up after I posted it, I reposted it again. You can click on the link, which has an electronic version to the handout. And you can download that PDF. And again, the vocabulary words are on page 3. Yep. So we promised we'd talk about these vocabulary words. Critical race theory will actually begin with next time. Systemic racism is the idea, so just to quickly say, systemic racism is the idea that racism is much more than just the individual hatreds that people feel. It's about systems that we create that perpetuate racism. They don't even necessarily have to be systems that are built on intentional racism, but rather they're systems that just perpetuate it. So when you have a federal government that says only loan here, when you have banks that say, okay, we'll only loan here, when you have real estate agents that say we're going to make a lot of money off of selling to these people or not to these people, it becomes entrenched in our systems. And so that's when we say systemic racism, that is what we need. And today's story in many ways is about that. We're not impugning anybody's intentions. We don't know if people who were involved with this were necessarily racist, but they created systems that had racist impact, that had racist effects. And so when we say systemic racism, that is what we're talking about. And much of our country has been predicated on those kinds of systems. So,
in general, very briefly, what some people call critical race theory, we would call systemic racism. But all of these words are open for you to look at, think about, and comment about it. I'm looking forward to hearing your reactions.
we'll take this story of history from today to the present in our next 3 classes together. So I wish everybody a pleasant rest of your evening, and hopefully everybody will have a chance to come back next week, and we look forward to seeing you. Have a lovely rest of your night.
Very much.